It's my pleasure to welcome General David Petraeus to the Cipher Brief studio, coming to us live at this moment from Munich, where, sir, it's been a rather different, rather emotional conference. What are your big takeaways?
Well, there has been no shortage of drama here. There's been a degree of excitement that isn't always present by any means here in Munich. And I just say, by the way, we miss not having you and Brad here with us, but it's great to be able to connect in this way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think some of the headlines, I know that Ukraine is a very important topic to you. We have had the pleasure of traveling to Ukraine with you 7 or 8 times over the last couple of years. Big news that Ukraine may not get the security guarantees that it needs as sort of some of these details are falling into place about talks. We understand at this point, and we know things are changing quickly, that Europeans are not expected to be at the table for a first round. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of this, and maybe more importantly, what you think the impact will be on any kind of future security agreement for Ukraine.
Well, first of all, I think there will be a security guarantee. I think there has to be a security guarantee. The question is what it will look like, whether a U.S. commander might be dual-hatted in leading it, or if it will be led by Europeans. It's that kind of question, I think. There has to be a security guarantee. I can't imagine that Ukraine could agree to anything that did not include a robust security guarantee. The question is what could be in it, just beyond a military response. Could it include, for example, automatic seizure of the $300 billion of Russian assets sitting in European banks? Could it include an automatic path to NATO membership for Ukraine? All of this in addition to whatever the military action might be taken by probably a coalition of the willing. In an ideal world, it would be a NATO operation led by an American 3-star, let's say, with a core headquarters that is then built into a NATO coalition headquarters with lots of European and U.S. assets in place to provide the response. By the way, one of the interesting elements has been a sense based on Secretary of Defense Hegseth's comments that the U.S. might not have boots on the ground in Ukraine. As I've thought about that, that's sort of old NATO. That's what we used to do in the Cold War days. In fact, as a second lieutenant, I was a rifle platoon leader in an airborne battalion in Vicenza, Italy. We were actually going to jump in to parts of NATO where there were not large NATO forces, say Eastern Turkey, the Turkish Thrace, but where the Soviet Union could come into NATO territory, literally to make sure, I guess, that we were going to die and bring the U.S. into the fight. You don't need to do that. The Ukrainians have a very substantial force on the ground. They can prevent any rapid Russian offensive from achieving much, just as they have been for many, many months, albeit giving up incremental elements of ground. The real question is, could you have an architecture that's essentially a NATO or, again, U.S. or coalition of the willing kill chain? Could you have lots of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets over Ukraine, tied into the Ukrainian intelligence system, a close link there, so that you absolutely know, without question, if the Russians come across whatever demilitarized zone might be established, or shoot across it, in which case, again, it would trigger some kind of response that could be with long-range assets from NATO soil. The 3 Baltic states, perhaps Eastern Poland, maybe even Romania. And of course, we have forces already in the Baltic states and in Eastern Poland as well. So the question is, what would the architecture of this be? But as I've thought about it, it doesn't trouble me that much that there would not be U.S. boots on the ground. So I think this, of course, will be the subject of enormous internal discussion with European NATO partners, with the Ukrainians, and so forth. But there has to be a security guarantee. I think it's the most important element of whatever negotiated outcome is agreed.
Yeah,
Beyond that,
yeah, go ahead, sir.
Beyond that, again, some moments of real drama here, if you will. I was at the lunch yesterday, the Ukraine lunch, at which General Kellogg, retired three-star, who has been named the envoy, but said that the Europeans would not be at the negotiating table. And in fact, as we have learned since then, the first negotiations will be in Saudi Arabia. The negotiators will actually not include General Kellogg. They'll be the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and then Special Envoy Witkoff. And then again, we'll see where it goes from there. But there was a bit of, the question was asked several times. So you mean the Europeans will not be at that? Now, to be fair, having 31 other countries or however many at the table is more than a bit unwieldy. But perhaps at some point there could be a thought about a contact group, such as we have seen before, where the U.S. has at the table, say, the EU High Rep, the UK, Germany, France, maybe Italy, something like that. But again, we'll see how this aspect of this plays out. General Kellogg apparently is going to interface with the Ukrainians, Witkoff with the Russians, but it's all happening very, very rapidly. In fact, General Kellogg said this is on Trump time, meaning that it's all being the catalyst of Trump's impatience is very much at play here. And there were a number of other moments of degree of drama. The vice president's speech about the state of democracy in Europe, and then his meeting with the far right German candidate for, 27 minutes supposedly, and then the leading candidate who's not in power, Friedrich Merz, with 3 minutes and not at all with the German chancellor who pushed back in his speech the subsequent day, and so forth. So there's been a lot of, again, diplomatic drama played out here over the weekend that is a bit unique in my experience of coming here almost continuously for the last 12 years, but at the very first time as the speechwriter for the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe back when I was a major a number of decades ago when the Cold War was still quite threatening.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
And the venue for the Munich Security Conference is not huge, so I can imagine the reverberations from this have been rather significant. It seems to be also a moment of reckoning, as I think you've mentioned, for European leaders who are now thinking differently about their own defense. Is that also what you're talking about?
Yeah, very much so. Again, I've watched, keep in mind, by the way, I was a NATO officer, if you will, or dual-hatted U.S. and NATO as a 1-star, 3-star, 4-star, in addition to the earlier assignments as a young officer, then a field grade officer, and so on. I've watched, therefore, as frustrated presidents or vice presidents or secretaries of defense rail away at the inadequate portion of GDP spent on defense by European nations, while noting that there have never been as many as right now that actually do meet the 2% of GDP on defense. It was agreed way back a couple of decades ago at the Wales summit. But clearly enormous pressure on them to do more. A recognition, the Secretary General of NATO, that it's probably going to have to be 3%, north of 3%, I think was the term that he used, and so forth. So that, I think there is a stark element in that regard that has never been as pointed and direct and so forth as it was here. Of course, the big threat, the real reason, the real catalyst for additional spending in recent years has not just been that President Obama or Biden or Trump 1 or Bush even was pushing them to spend more. It's the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. First, the occupation of territory in 2014, then the full-scale invasion, of course, now almost 3 years ago.
Yeah. And of course, they've added members as well since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Let me ask you for a moment. We were in Ukraine with you last September, and people already were starting to understand they were going to have to give up things they didn't want to give up in order to end this war. There was this reality kind of sinking in. But Ukraine has made incredible advances on the technology front, on the innovation front. You also wear your KKR hat. and you think about the future of investment in defense technology, what do you think that future looks like for Ukraine? Because once a deal is finally reached, they still have a lot to build on, don't they?
They have it. This will be the military industrial colossus of Europe. And by the way, I'm going in again from here. I go to Warsaw tonight and then overnight into Ukraine and spend the week there as they approach the 3-year anniversary of the launching of the full-scale invasion in 2022. And you'll recall when we visited the Nemesis Battalion on our last trip, how extraordinary is the partnership and unique is the partnership between those who design the unmanned system. So it's not just aerial drones, it's also maritime drones that have sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and forced the final Russian ship out of the centuries occupied port of Sevastopol in Crimea. It is ground systems now. Of course, back in December, the Ukrainians conducted the first ever complete unmanned systems attack. It's never been done in history that we know of. All remotely operated aerial and various ground robotic systems and vehicles. So again, this is a system. Now, of course, nothing concentrates the mind like the prospect of losing your independence, fighting for your very survival. But this is a system that they have that now produces tomorrow's technology for today's wars. And I don't think it's overly too hyperbolic to say that our procurement system, especially for major items, tends to produce yesterday's technology for tomorrow's wars. In fact, we absolutely have to overhaul our system, noting that there are vested interests in the military-industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to describe it, that want to continue to have existing platforms, existing basing arrangements, existing manufacturing and maintenance and all the rest of that. So we should be learning much more rapidly from this. They are on the cutting edge of technology. You'll recall when we were with the Nemesis Battalion, this is all unclassified. They actually have a website you can go to, shows their greatest hits from the air and so forth. These are all the tech bros of Ukraine are now in this ecosystem. They're either designing, manufacturing, or actually employing these particular systems. And they're iterating not just with software, as the Russian jammers or electronic warfare or air defense or other countermeasures are employed. They're changing hardware on a weekly or bi-weekly basis as well. It's really something that has to be seen to be appreciated. And as you recall, the systems they're producing are really very capable and yet very cheap, relative speaking, to our suicide drones or our out and back drones and so forth. The latest adaptation, Suzanne, which is really interesting, is that they're avoiding the jamming. They're literally rolling out fiber optic cable, very, very thin, very light, and so forth, from the drone as it goes out so that they can maintain communications, command and control, the visual picture and so forth. That's how they're getting around the increasingly effective Russian electronic warfare posture, jamming, air defense, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And when we were there with you, I found it fascinating that Ukraine has the ability to manufacture far more drones than it is able to currently, and potentially with the end of the war, will then be able to export that drones. Can you kind of connect that for me to the fact that you see them becoming a powerhouse?
They could do that now if they had the money and the orders. President Zelensky initially, I think wisely, said, we're not going to export anything. We're going to use it on our battlefield. And as you recall, they are throwing thousands of suicide drones at the Russians on the front lines every day. There are hundreds more that are going out and coming back, at least for 12 or 15 missions until they're shot down. There are dozens going into Russian airspace every night, going after the Russian energy refineries, the storage locations, sometimes strategic airfields, and so on. So this is how they are overcoming being very heavily outmanned and outgunned, and also inflicting extraordinary casualties on the Russians. And the Russians also can't replace the hardware now that they're losing, the armored systems and so on. They're already well into the old stocks that they had that have been refurbished and brought back on the battlefield. And they just can't. They're actually now, in many cases, just using infantry for the attacks. And of course, probably reflecting their concern about whether they can continue to recruit Russian men willing to go into this very lethal battlefield. They actually have had 10,000 North Koreans on the battlefield in Kursk, that area in Russia that Ukraine attacked into and still holds half of what it was they seized. And those North Koreans have been absolutely slaughtered. So very, very lethal battlefield. Ukraine on the cutting edge of this technology, way beyond where we are, frankly, in its ability to. They produced 1.5 million drones in the first 9 months of last year, according to President Zelensky. And they could actually export now if they had the money and the orders, and that would help them actually make money and then buy more drones. But when the guns fall silent, the capacity here is going to be the most extraordinary in the world. If you look at the numbers of what we've provided, usually it was hundreds or maybe small numbers of thousands of suicide drones in total, and realize that they're throwing thousands of drones at the Russians every single day. This is really quite stunning. It is the future of warfare in many respects, albeit a lot of differences to the potential scenarios in which we might be involved with our coalition partners.
I'm fascinated by that. And I've been asking you for the last 2 years now what you think it will take, once again, with your KKR hat on, in sort of determining when it's safe to have foreign investment come into Ukraine and really start investing heavily in their manufacturing capabilities and their ability to export some of these things to the rest of the world and essentially really grow. And you kept saying, not quite yet, Suzanne, not quite yet, Suzanne. I wonder if you think the time is getting much closer now that we may see an end to this war.
Well, I think it is much closer. And as you know, since you're co-hosting, albeit remotely, with Brave One, this gathering in Kyiv next week that I'll attend and at which I'll speak, of Ukrainian tech companies, they're ready to take investment. And I think it will probably be the more of the lower end of the venture capital, growth tech, that kind of investor initially. And then over time, you'll get the large investors who are looking for huge deals. But it's going to require the guns to fall silent, I think. But by the way, many other attractive opportunities. The minerals are in bold relief right now after President Trump floated an idea that Ukraine would sign over $500 billion worth of strategic minerals and so forth to the U.S. in return for the, whatever it is, couple hundred billion that they've actually gotten from the U.S. Keep in mind that much of these aid packages has actually been spent in the U.S. To replenish our own stocks with more modern munitions after we have given Ukraine what we had on hand. So, again, I think there are going to be incredible opportunities here. Let's not forget the agriculture. They're somewhere in the order of 20 or more % of grain exports, not grain production, but exports. And by the way, the clearing out of the Russian Black Sea fleet from the Western Black Sea, forced by this combination of aerial and maritime Ukrainian drones, has meant that they're once again able to export to countries like Egypt and North Africa and other North African countries that are so highly dependent on Ukraine for their very food security.
Mm-hmm. So I would say, sir, as you're heading into Ukraine this week, let me just ask you, you'll be keeping an eye, obviously, on the talks in Saudi Arabia that are expected now to happen. What are the indicators that you're going to see that Ukraine might be getting security guarantees that it needs out of those talks? What will you be watching for?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, just the commitment to a security guarantee. Then over time, what form will that security guarantee be? What will it consist of? Will it be not just kinetic military activity? Where will it be based and so forth, as I've described? Again, it doesn't actually have to come from Ukrainian soil. It could come from outside Ukraine. But then Could it incorporate, again, a commitment to NATO membership for Ukraine if their sovereignty is once again violated? Could it consist of, again, all of the 300 billion being seized or some increment of that? There's a number of different combinations and permutations to this. But that, in my mind, if I were a leader in Ukraine, that's what really matters. I mean, we know the other contours probably will consist of Russia continuing to occupy 20% or so of Ukrainian territory. But by the way, what do they do about Ukrainian occupation of that part of Kursk? But again, the broad contours, I think you can actually envision demilitarized zones, ceasefire, etc. It's the security guarantee that really matters. And what that consists of, I think, will be the focus of Ukrainian leaders in particular.
Yeah. Brad Christian did an excellent interview yesterday with Bill Browder about the seizing of that Russian fund, of Russian funds in general. Let me ask you, sir, closing thoughts for you from Munich. As you mentioned right off the top, it's been somewhat of an exciting one, maybe not always in positive ways exciting, but a lot of buzz there. What are your closing thoughts?
By the way, first, I just met with Bill Browder, and we were discussing exactly what we've just been discussing here. There's been sort of a wave of emotions here. There's some stunned Europeans at various times, a bit of disbelief about this and that. But as you then think it through and realize this and other realities could really lead the Europeans to doing more for their own defense, which is a long time in coming. This could actually bring about a ceasefire in Ukraine. You could fashion a security guarantee that doesn't require U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine, on and on. I think you emerge with a bit more equanimity, perhaps. There have been pluses and minuses, but there always are. There's always a degree of drama here, but this seemed to have more than the ordinary amount of that quality.
I'm certain of that. General David Petraeus, it's always such a pleasure. We're so grateful for your time and helping us put this into context. I think you've given us some bright spots to look forward to in a sea of otherwise pretty dour headlines at the moment. Sir, thank you. We're wishing you safe travels.
Privileged to be with you as always, Suzanne, and privileged to be one of your Cipher Brief experts.
Thank you so much.